Hi, everybody. I'm Wendy Silvers, founder of Million Mamas Movement. And today is Saturday, and in the United States, it is the July 4th holiday or Independence Day. And I want you to have a different understanding of what July 4th means for the First People and for people of color. And so I invited my friend and colleague, Heather Ray, to join us so that you can, I'm going to tell you more about Heather Ray in a second, but before we proceed, what I'd really like to do is set the space with just some spoken words. So I'm just going to invite you wherever you are. If you're driving, please do not close your eyes, but if you are somewhere where you can sit down and just move into your heart for just a couple of minutes, I just invite you to do that. So, and so how very grateful and thankful I am for the heartbeat of the Mother, Father, God presence that lives within me and is in the ground that I walk upon. How grateful I am for this opportunity to step away from the outer noise of condition and circumstance and event, and dive deep into that place and that space within, for I know absolutely and resolutely that all that there is love. That this infinite love is what creates, sustains, and maintains galaxies. And it is the same living, loving intelligence that orders and activates every cell, every atom, every organ, action, and function of my body, my mind, my spirit. And each and every person that walks this earth, as well as the two-leggeds and the four-leggeds, I know that right where they are, the allness and the fullness and the oneness of this love is this presence, this great spirit, great mystery. And so from this place of oneness, I bless this time together with Heather, absolutely calling forth enlightenment, upliftment, empowerment, and truth. Dedicating these moments to the revelations of that which is for the highest and the greatest good of all people, giving great thanks to the first people, giving great thanks to the Black people and the people of color, giving great thanks to the white people that continually wake up and open their hearts and their minds and their souls to be the light bearers and the paradigm shifters, to support all. For when there is freedom for one, there must be freedom for all. And so we come together in this time to absolutely set a vibrational set point for oneness, for clarity, for empowerment, for enlightenment, and for dissolving injustice, prejudice, racism, systemically, endemically, so that there may be a world that is kind and just for all. So with an open and grateful heart for all that unfolds in our dialogue, I am grateful and thankful. I release this word into the law. I know it goes forth. I know it is made manifest, and I let it be, saying, and so it is. So it is. Aho. Ashe.
Thank you, Wendy.
My pleasure. Absolutely. So for those of you that are tuning in, my guest today is Heather Ray, and she is an American film producer, director, and actress. She grew up in the mountains of central Idaho. She has worked on more than 24 documentary and narrative films and is known for Frozen River, Trudell, and Tallulah, among a plethora of projects. She is a mom, she is a wife, she's a sister, she's so many beautiful things, and she's very, very connected to the First People. And when I was thinking about wanting to educate people and bring information forth about today, Heather just came to my mind because I also have a connection to the philosophy and the beauty of the first people. I was initiated into the Wolf Clan teachings of Grandma Triley Nitsch in the 90s. And when I was 12, I mean, it goes before that, but when I was 12, I want to show you one of my classmates in were we in middle school, Angela and I did a project on Touch the Earth. And when I was doing a lot of film PR, I did PR for the film about the Shoshone Indians called To Protect Mother Earth. So I cherish the first people. And so I'm really glad you're here. And let's talk about the real meaning of, or how the impact of July 4th.
Well, thank you very much for asking me, Wendy, to talk with you today, to have this conversation. And I want to just first acknowledge the land, that we live on. For those of us who live here in Los Angeles, and depending where you are in the city, you for the most part, Los Angeles is Tongva. It's unceded Tongva territory. I'm in the San Fernando Valley on the north side of the Hollywood Hills, so I'm technically on Tataviam land, and the Fernandinho Tataviam, their tribal offices are about 15 minutes up the road from me. And if you go towards the coast and up the coast, then that's traditionally Chumash territory. It's Kitsch territory. As you go into more Tongva territory, there's it's all native land, which is true of all of North America. It's true of all of the Americas.
Right.
But in the case in the United States, almost all cities in the U.S. are unceded tribal land, meaning that there was never an actual treaty that signed over this land. And there really are no American cities where the people of that land are being recognized by the federal government, with the exception of maybe Orlando, Florida, where the Seminoles are there. And if you look at Palm Springs, it's kind of a checkerboard between the Aguascalientes and the Palm Springs city. But for the most part, like these nations here in what we currently call Los Angeles, they're not recognized by the federal government, and they've been fighting for many years. The Tataviam are very close in that process of federal recognition. My understanding is they're maybe in the top 3 tribal groups or tribal nations in the US currently that are very, very close to being federally recognized, which is incredible. So I want to just start by acknowledging, the land that we live on. And we're really fortunate, particularly when we're on land, that, the people whose land it is, they themselves don't have the actual authority to live on this land as they should be. So, I feel quite lucky. And although I'm a Native person or have Native heritage, I am a guest on this land, and I'm really grateful for that. So I want to start with that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
so this holiday, and I'm not necessarily an expert in the kind of American history that you learn in our educational system. I have a deeper base of knowledge in what we might call alternative histories, because I had to seek it out myself. But what I do know is that this document, this Declaration of Independence, I think it's 244 years today, that we've been at this. I mean, that document actually, in language, in the document refers to Native people, the original, inhabitants and caretakers of the land. It refers to Native people as merciless Indian savages. And certainly by all means in that language suggests that Indigenous people are anything but human, and that the rightful, righteous, inhabitants, the Americans, the colonists, that those are the people who really, were given the God-given cause to come and to conquer these lands, and to go forth and prosper and have equality for all of them. So the document, not only does it completely dehumanize Native people, it also is an acknowledgement of the fact that there were, human beings who, were taken from the continent of Africa, and as well as, many, many indigenous people from the Americas, that were enslaved at that time. And so somehow this document that is declaring some kind of independence, it's really just for white Christians, and it has its own, roots and connection, as Manifest Destiny does, as we move further in time and go into westward expansion. Manifest Destiny, the Declaration of Independence, and prior to that, the Doctrine of Discovery. These are these key documents and set of ideas that tie to, essentially kind of 5 centuries of a system as we know it, that is really a system of white supremacy. And it's white supremacy, it's species supremacy, it's looking at human beings as somehow being superior to the rest of our, of our natural worlds. We're part of, we're part of a natural world. We are a species. And so all of that kind of system of dominance has really given way to, the extraordinary destruction of people, of the natural world. I mean, you could really identify that British and American imperialism are truly responsible for the destruction of the planet and things like climate change. I mean, it's kind of interesting to even imagine that something like climate change, global warming, are tied to white supremacy, but they are, they're connected. So, this is not a holiday that I personally, I mean, I certainly like the idea of what, that America is supposed to be based on, but it's just inauthentic to think that what they were doing was actually an expression of the kind of ideals that they were articulating. It's just, it's completely inauthentic. There's no integrity in it.
There's not an integrity between the words and actions. There's no congruency. When I was rereading the Declaration last night before I sent out an email to my community, and it talks about the inalienable rights for the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness, equality for all, and that if there's anything that citizens don't agree with, then that can't be passed. And I'm thinking, okay, so first of all, this was written by slave-owning white men. There was no acknowledgement of the native people of the land or the Black people that were kidnapped and enslaved. Mm-hmm. The women were enslaved. The children had no, I mean, they were not maybe shackled in the same way, but they were enslaved and had no freedom, no rights, no liberty. And children were thought of as non-essentials. I mean, they didn't have a lot of rights. So, I mean, when you look at that as the foundation of what they call the birth of a free nation. Now, in this conversation, I do want to acknowledge how grateful I am that we can have this conversation in terms of there are nations where this would not even be permitted, where we would be in severe physical danger for having this conversation. So I want to presence that. But that's kind of it, because I've been inside the political system with health freedom and watching legislators lie and present misinformation. I have witnessed big tech completely censor any voices that are opposite to the sponsorship or the agenda. So that again speaks to the colonization and the white supremacy and the what's pervasive in our societies. So when we talk about freedom, July 4th, for me as well, the only thing that I do celebrate is the fact that we can speak freely.
Mm-hmm.
But when you really dive underneath that, there isn't that level of freedom that supposedly our founding fathers were intending to set forth. And specifically, I mean, with the Native people and Black people. So I would love for you to share more about that so people can really understand that we're not anti-American. We're not grateful to be here and having the freedoms, but to celebrate July 4th as an Independence Day is not congruent with the way the people of the nation are being treated.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I think it goes back to, historic context. And the reality is this country is a house that was built on a foundation with no integrity. And I mean, like, in structural terms. I mean, if you think about architecture and the way that architects talk about structural integrity, the country was built on a foundation with no integrity. And without integrity, nothing works. So, I mean, it's just, the reality is it probably isn't going to work out, in the form that we as we know it. And I think that part of what's happening right now in the country with the level of uprising, and I mean, it's been there all along. There's always been the resistance. And the resistance has been what has enabled people to survive and for things to actually transform. So I think it's really important to always be an acknowledgement of those ancestors, our own ancestors that resisted, all the ways in which people have been, enslaved, hunted, controlled, it is truly because of resistance that we can even have the freedom to speak, that you're referencing. And that includes those founding fathers resisting something within the monarchy system, So, I mean, I think we can acknowledge that in a kind of kernel of an idea.
Exactly.
But I think that part of what comes with what I would call colonial consciousness is all of these ideas of supremacy and, superiority. And so, when those people immigrating from Europe came to conquer the new world, if you will, and this is going back to even Columbus so-called discovering these lands, which of course he didn't discover anything. He actually never even stepped foot on what we call the United States. He was only in the island system, where the islands are. But if we look at those people who had originally come as colonists, they had the idea, as per written in the Doctrine of Discovery, that if somebody wasn't Christian, that they weren't a human being. Even in the Doctrine of Discovery, which was from 1494 or 1491 or whatever it was, just around the time that Columbus was traveling, in that Doctrine of Discovery, essentially they divided up the world and made a decision about, which parts of the world that Europe could take for itself, because anyone who wasn't Christian, those lands could be dominated. And that set off, now 5 centuries of a system that, it's just not real. and we have to find the ways in which that we can challenge it and essentially dismantle it if we're going to see this thing go forth into something that could be, an actual working system. So all this uprising we're seeing now, all this dialogue and what feels like division and collision, all of that, which it is, but it all is actually I believe, serving a greater end, which is to see what this country can become. This is a very young country, in terms of countries, this is a very young country.
Mhm.
I often think of it as like a teenage boy, you know. It's like a teenage boy country. Like it's kind of cocky and arrogant and thinks it knows everything. And, you know, it's got this way about it. And it's a very powerful country. It's an economically powerful country, you know. But Europe and the Americas, you know, they, particularly in North America, Canada and the US, but specifically like Great Britain and the United States, these countries got what they got built on slavery
Mhm.
and the complete resource extraction of the global South. In other words, the British Empire would not be what it is, and this is true of all of Western Europe, and the United States would not be what it is if it weren't for slavery. And that's slavery then and slavery now. There's more slavery now than there's ever been in all of time, because there's more people and
Mhm.
slavery is pervasive.
Mhm.
And as Americans, regardless of what our ethnicity or background is or whatever, as Americans really participating and benefiting from this settler colonial system, we all participate in global slavery. We like things to be cheap. You know,
Yes.
it's one of the things Americans
Yes.
like things to be cheap. You know, you
Mhm.
want to go to H&M and you want to buy a shirt that costs, you know, $11. And you're not going to get that unless it's coming from distressed and exploited labor. And that's a reality.
Mhm.
And if someone that can't understand that, then I say take the 30 minutes and research it on the internet and figure it out, because that's real. You know, we are all participating in and contributing in the reality of global slavery.
Mhm.
And I think that oftentimes we separate ourselves from things and even want to talk about things in historic terms, having lost sight of the connection that it has to now, you know.
Mhm. Well, I think it's important to look back at history to see what's been laid out, because we, like you said, we're not set. It's not separate. It's like, oh, that was then. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
we are living the experience of that which was set forth. And what's really interesting to me when you think of what you're talking about in terms of global slavery and wanting something for less expensive money, I can remember being somewhere with relatives and they were talking about their businesses, and they have factories overseas. And I can remember this like yesterday, because I was sitting there with my now husband, and I said to them, well, don't you think about the people, that the children and the community that's being exploited? And these businessmen turned on me and said, well, we're giving them a better life than they would have if we weren't there. They have a place to sleep, they have food to eat. And I just thought, wow, wow. Like,
Yeah.
not a thought about how can I improve their lives. It's like that, it's like that famous saying that Yeshua said, I can feed you, or I can teach you how to fish. And so it's that idea of, what about bringing all of that wealth and helping people be able to take care of themselves? That's really giving to people. That's so.
Yeah, and also acknowledging that the reason why, you know, many nation states or regions in the world are experiencing systemic poverty is because of Western Europe and the United States, Canada, now China. It's because of those global capitalist interests that have gone in and completely destroyed the infrastructure of economy and even government in so many. I mean, Europe colonized Africa, you know, I
Yeah.
mean, it colonized the Americas, it colonized Africa, it colonized, you know, a large portion of Asia and Indo-Europe, you know, Indo-Asian countries. I mean, Western Europe colonized the world. And so that, you know, to think about why so many parts of the world have these incredibly strict economic systems, and this is where I think that we oftentimes fail ourselves in terms of not just our education within our educational system, but also our own individual ability to pursue education and knowledge, to actually take the responsibility that it takes to really to say, I want to understand how this works. I'm going to actually pursue and study global economics so that I can understand, you know, what is the phenomenon of American interests undermining Latin American governments and economies. That's been happening for decades. You know, we can figure that out. That information is there. The books are there. The knowledge is there. We can understand that things would not be as they are in Central America, for example, in terms of the suppression of economy, if it were not for American corporations going in and undermining those. So it's, you know, this country created as a colonizer state continues to colonize. It wasn't just us being colonized, you know, as original people, or, you know, like people who had been, their bodies had been stolen and brought into slavery in the Americas, or even some of the early European, you know, citizens who were of a lower economic status and were brought in forms of indentured servitude and whatnot. There was an entire body labor class that has been colonized by what this country is. But the problem is that it's continuing to happen. You know, the United States is an extraordinary global bully, you know, and we're all a part of it, you know, and we can social justice our ways, you know, through our social media and through the streets of our cities, but we really are a part of all, we are a part of what's happening. You know, we participate in it, we benefit from it. And I think that's sometimes what I feel like is missing. You know, and I'm a social justice warrior. You're a social justice warrior. Many of them, I'm sure the people who work with, you know, your community of listeners and, you know, and community of like-minded thinkers, we're all warriors in our own right. But I just so strongly believe we have to stay consistently self-checking and really understanding the system that we're participating in.
I absolutely agree with you. I absolutely agree with you. And we were talking before we started recording about, I believe that there is a coming of age for a lot of people, even in the spiritual worlds, because it almost reminds me of people that, and I'm not saying this is it, but it's how what I'm thinking, or as the metaphor is like not wanting to get your hands too dirty. It's like this, I don't want to get my consciousness too dirty with the negativity. So I'm just going to stay in the light and love. And so I can speak to both of that, because I know that in the absolute, in that high vibrational frequency, everything is happening according to a divine order. Like none of this would be happening if there wasn't a collective agreement on the unseen side. So that is a, you know, it's like having this simultaneous awareness. So I recognize that. However, we as human beings having, spiritual beings having a human life experience, also have free will to transform things and to raise our consciousness so that we live from a higher octave, a higher frequency, which is about love and compassion and generosity and communion and harmony and really respecting each other, because we're all sparks of the divine. We are all representations of the one. Each of us and all of us are connected to the one. So I feel like there is a coming of age for people that have historically been like, oh no, I'm gonna just be here and I'll do this. So we are all 100% responsible for everything that is happening.
Yeah.
And that I think is really hard for people to fully take in, because what that means is you then have a responsibility. So, you know, clean house, clean here, clean your heart on a daily basis, and then take actions that are yours to take. It's not about shaming anybody, but it's about let's let's widen the lens here. Let's bring this out. Because really also when I hear you talk, Heather, what I think about is when I think of systemic racism and oppression, I also think of systemic trauma. I believe, and especially with the visual of George Floyd being murdered and also Ahmaud Arbery being cornered, and the many Black men and women that have been murdered. What I believe is that now with the pandemic and the forced isolation, a lot of people are suffering, and they're suffering alone. And there's a lot of trauma. I mean, there's the kids that have been separated from their parents at the border, that are growing up alone without parents, which just blows the attachment and the necessity of the attachment at young ages, which we know so much about. And the decimation of the first people. And then, so I feel like we are at a really potent time in life history, like life science, where we truly are being called to wake up, step up, and step out.
Yeah. That was so beautiful, everything you said.
Oh,
thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that there's nothing more high vibration than speaking truth to power. Like it's one of the highest states that you can be in. And there's moments in which, I certainly, in bringing truth and endeavoring to bring words to something, there are moments when I so firmly feel my own ancestors with me, like literally right next to me, guiding the words and guiding knowledge and moving energy through us. And so I think that, there is nothing more high frequency than being truthful. And if a person, has the ability to remove themselves from everything that's happening in our world, to stay in some kind of perceived status of love and light, that's a manifestation of a kind of privilege that I don't even understand. I'm too sensitive. I feel.
Yeah.
And I don't know how a person could be both high vibration and not have the capacity to feel. That doesn't quite compute for me. I think that we have to be able to be connected, to everything it is, because what you were saying, which was so beautiful, which is we really are part of, and I've spent, years studying, physics and quantum physics and pushing my work more into, the work in the quantum field and really understanding the manifestations of things. And yes, you can reach those places where you understand the ultimate perfection of all things. We are here as human beings in a human experience to learn lessons, to grow as energy, as a collective, energy beings in the capacity to create, as does our creator. I feel like I understand all of that. And I've had moments where I really understand it empirically, which are high moments, And all of that said, here we are in a moment, in a day and time, this country in which, some folks will say what we now know as, what we now know as California, what we now know as United States. And there's an incredible Cherokee professor and author, Dr. Adrienne Keene, and she has a blog called Native Appropriations. And she says, it's what we currently know as. It's not that we now know as, it's what we currently know as the United States. Because the truth is, I don't really know what's going to happen. I'm not sure that any of it's not that static, it's, and I've had elders say to me, nothing this self-destructive is going to last, which means that, and I've had my own visions of this, for whatever, that's worth.
It's worth a lot.
Well, it's just been something as I've experienced, but what it means that is that it may cease to be what we know it as. Thank God, it could very well cease to be as we know it, and then it's going to evolve into something else.
Mm-hmm.
And when it evolves into something else, then it's all of us, the work that we have to do, as citizens, as, people who are loyal, perhaps not to this nation state, but to this land. Mm-hmm. Then it becomes, on all of us to actually make sure that whatever it evolves into, that it's something that's going to be better for our children, for our future generations, something that's going to be better for the earth, and our responsibility to her. So I personally am not convinced that it's going to stay what it is. And I've even spoken to some, really powerful astrologers who've said what the astrological profile of this country looks like, closer to the end of this year and toward the beginning of this coming year. I mean, it's changing. It is changing. And I think it's really incredible and it's powerful, and it gives us the opportunity in a place where we have stronger voices. We do. Like you said at the beginning of this conversation, we can speak like this now. We can speak like this to the degree that it allows us to be able to have these conversations and to empower each other, to empower, those around us and ourselves, so that we can speak truth to power in such a way that this country could possibly evolve into something that does embody the very kernel that those so-called founding fathers were endeavoring to create.
Mm-hmm.
That is possible. Now,
I agree.
Constitution, the US Constitution is based on the Iroquois Confederacy. Mm-hmm. It's based on the Great Law of Peace, which is, the Great Law of Peace, they don't even know how old it is. I mean, the Haudenosaunee, or what we also know as Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee have lived according to the Great Law of Peace for millennium, and the Six Nations people in the Northeastern Corridor, those are civilizations that have lived with democracy for thousands and thousands of years. And when the so-called founding fathers, were creating this idea of democracy, they sort of referenced Greece, but Greece, or Rome, excuse me, this kind of ancient, Greco-Roman cultures, but Rome only had democracy for about 8 months. And then it went back to mayhem and slavery and an empire and all of that. So that isn't real. Democracy as a concept is based on, in the indigenous societal and philosophical structures of the people of this land. And Ben Franklin spent quite a bit of time hanging out with the Haudenosaunee. Like he was an ally and friend. He was close with, those people. And he was the one who then, at a certain point, brought George Washington and Thomas Jefferson in and said, you should check this out, the way in which these people live, the way in which they're organizing their societies. It's really fascinating. And then they ended up adopting the Iroquois Confederacy. There were 2 parts of it that they left out. You don't already know this, you're gonna love this.
No, yeah, please tell.
The 2 parts that they left out that were part of, that are part of the original Iroquois Confederacy that the Constitution is based on. The first was the 7th generation principle.
Yeah.
The idea that anything and everything that we do, we need to be mindful of and thinking of 7 generations from now. We're a midpoint between ancestor and descendant. That's really what we are. On a continuum, we're a midpoint between ancestor and descendant. So it's that acknowledgement of making sure that we're protecting 7 generations from now. They left that out. The other thing, the other thing that they left out that's a part of the Iroquois Confederacy is the Council of Grandmothers. Yes. That at the clan mothers that could at any point deem a leader to be unfit for leadership, or an action taken or a law created that was deemed to be unfit and not serving the people, that Council of Grandmothers could veto anything and take any leader out of power.
Mm.
You know, and I'm not an expert in any of this, so I'm sort of speaking from my own knowledge and the research and time that I put into it. But you know, that is as I've been told, and I think that this is, you know, these are the histories that we don't know, because of the manifestations of white supremacy and Eurocentricity in the American educational system. I mean, you really go to education in this country, K through 12, and learn to worship Europe. And so, you know, in terms of like the standardized public American curricula, like what's required by law, federally speaking, in American education, there's only one paragraph that is required by law about American Indians, and it ends in 1890. So there's only seven states that teach anything about Native Americans past 1890. So we have no contemporary understanding of Native people, and it firmly places Native people in the distant past, a kind of museum state, if you will. So we don't know anything about, you know, we're this young country that sits on top of this bedrock of ancient and profound civilizations, and we don't have those access points to understand anything about the civilizations and the peoples that we live, you know, that we're connected to. We live, you know, it's almost as if the people are ghosts amongst us, you know. And it makes me feel so, and my heart is hurting right now, to be honest. It's so painful, you know, to me, but it makes me also feel so saddened for our children, because I really believe that children who are so beautiful and wide open, they want to know, you know, the children naturally have integrity. You know, if a child knew that they were growing up on Tongva land, and that land had been taken illegally, and those people had once been hunted, you know, and you know, for money. I mean, just the things that they knew would have happened to the people that are their neighbors, and you know, the rightful caretakers of and the children would always want to do the right thing. You know, and I feel like we deny American children the opportunity to really understand who they are and where they come from. You know, invisibility is a very powerful form of racism.
Oh,
A lot. Sorry.
That was just wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for all that you said. So I'm really appreciative that you talked about that, and that you talked about the seventh generation and the Council of Mothers. Oh my God, you know, that speaks to my heart. And I think about greed. I think about how greed leads many people off. I think about how the Native people were decimated and hunted and given a blanket with smallpox. I mean, way back when. And you don't hear about that in the history books, like what really happened. I have a friend, Dr. Sheila Lewis-Ely, and when I met her in 2015, she would say to me, Wendy, it's revisionist history. And so when you speak about the history and the education, I think about how it's whose agenda is this fitting, and how I feel like we are at such a pivotal point in humanity at this point. And it reminds me of the Atlantean Lemurian times. Like we're really at this point of, are we going to soar? But you know, I want to speak to that, because I believe that those of us that are catching this, those of us that are awake and continually awakening, and those that are awakening, I believe that when we join together in collective consciousness and we hold that space, we can help provide that foundation. We can have that bridge for those that are really stuck and attached to things remaining the same. If there's anything that this quarantine has hopefully taught people, is that nothing will ever be the same again.
Yes.
So, but what it asks of us is to be the architects, to be the spiritual midwives, like you spoke of, from speaking with the powerful astrologers and probably shamans that you've spoken with. It behooves us to really anchor the world that we would like, because what we see in front of us is so divisive, and it's not even true. So much of it is photo op, right? It's like, it's not even, what do we really care about? How can we help the next 7 generations? I love how you said we are the midpoint between the ancestors and the descendants. Oh, that's so beautiful. And right, I mean, what I want for our kids in the next 7 generations is a world where there's equity and equality and connection, where there's clean air and clean water and clean food, and nobody's forced to do anything, because they organically live in this place of love. And if and when there are conflicts, there's a way to process through them that doesn't immediately make an enemy image. Like, that's, you know, with that whole systemic racism and all of the education and the white supremacy, along with that is enemy images. I mean, if you make a Native or Black person not even a human being, then it makes it easy to exterminate them and the Jews and whoever else steps out of line and whoever else might pose a challenge, you know. So I really feel like these dialogues, sitting in sacred council and really holding space for this, we're doing a, you know, a vibrational bookmark, because we're at a tipping point. George Floyd was a tipping point. It tipped. It was just like, oh no. So now you've got, you know, so now we're here. Now we're here where we're having these conversations, finally. I mean, you know, it's these kind of things where you would have a conversation with somebody and then you could see how, like, the eyes would glaze or they would shut down. You'd be like, okay, all right, I'll move on down the list. I'll just find somebody else to have this conversation with, so we can change.
Absolutely.
And you know, I love the speaking truth to power. And I once heard Michael Beckwith say, speaking truth to pseudo power.
That's excellent.
Right? Because we give these
absolutely.
people, I mean, we elect these, the elected officials want to hear everything that we have to say when they're running. And then all of a sudden they get elected, and then they don't even take your phone calls, or they say you can't come to their office, or, you know, they have a meeting with Monsanto, and I mean, you know, or something like that, or pharma or big tech. And then they're like, yeah, whatever. Yes, you know, okay, yeah, great to see you. Yes, I remember you. And then I mean, I think about when you talk about this beautiful earth, and I think about Elon Musk's intention to have 100,000 satellites. I think it's 100,000. I might even be off. It might be a million satellites implanted into our atmosphere. And the rush for artificial intelligence and the rush for a vaccine that is going to, that they want administered to every living being. And I think, okay, we got to get that sacred council together yesterday. Like, it's beyond time to, like, create a new world, because that's crazy, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, I mean, the thing about human beings is that human beings are incredibly, you know, resilient and industrious. And so, you know, I don't know what we will evolve into. I hope that it can be more congruous with, you know, a sort of relationship to reality that, you know, that I myself want to participate in, which is living in accordance with the earth, you know, living as a more evolved humanity. But it's hard to say, you know, what will happen. I mean, I don't know if we know, but we are on this journey, and we have to, you know, we have to commit ourselves to something. And something you said about when people kind of glaze over, from my perspective, the glazing over I think is connected to one's own trauma. And, you know, and you spoke about trauma a while back in our conversation. You said something about just referencing the trauma. Nobody is exempt from trauma. But I do think that some have buried it deeper, you know, and it's one of the things that I feel quite strongly about in terms of, you know, people understanding where they come from, like really having, you know, a strong sense of what I like to call the archaeology of self, like to really do our own, you know, a deep dive into understanding where we come from, because we are a midpoint between ancestor and descendant. So there's an entire lineage that has informed who we are and where we come from. And it's important to, you know, to be respectful of where we've come from and those ancestors. And sometimes we're actually doing the work to clean up, you know, and to restore integrity within our lineages. But we're certainly and absolutely carrying trauma. And, you know, whether that is a familial trauma that's come through families, you know, human beings struggling, you know, just to be human beings, struggling with poverty, struggling with the cycles of abuse and addiction and alcoholism and all the things that, you know, have impacted our families over generations and generations. So those traumas exist in our familial systems, but they also exist within, you know, the ways in which our civilizations and our, you know, the formations of, you know, how our ancestors lived. And I think that one of the things that often people who descend from Europe don't understand is that, you know, at the point that Europe set out to colonize the world 500 years ago, well, prior to that, Europe had colonized itself. You know, in other words, and this is something that one of my, you know, greatest mentors, John Trudell, would talk about, but, you know, up until 1,000 years ago, every single human being on this planet was a member of a tribe. And it was at that point that Europe began to cannibalize itself. Europe destroyed the tribes of Europe. And so prior to Europe, you know, 500 years ago, essentially, you know, heading into this, you know, 5 centuries of a system of domination and resource extraction and the exploitation of other human beings and whatnot. Well, it had spent 500 years doing it to itself, you know, including the complete subjugation and extermination of its women, you know. And I mean, Europe spent 300 to 350 years killing its women, you know, in this system, this dominator system of Christianity and Catholicism, and based on this idea, you know, of witchery and whatnot. Well, how could that not have an impact on the psyche of those who are the descendants of the tribes of Europe? How could that not impact the people of European descent? You know, to have centuries, and there's estimations that may have been as many as 15 million women. That's I mean, in terms of the population of that continent at that point in time, that's a lot of people. That's a genocide. And it never gets referred to as a genocide. You know, we know of the genocides in other parts of the world. We understand the Holocaust. We never ever talk about the killing of the women of Europe as a genocide. And that was the women, you know, who had all of the herb knowledge, who were the carriers of all the kind of deeper, you know, plant and earth and celestial and mythological and mystic wisdom, you know, and the men who were the carriers of that knowledge were also exterminated. So, you know, it was one of the things when European colonists were first coming into the northeastern corridor, you know, of this land, of Turtle Island, and there was that period of, you know, of hunting the witches. It was one of the things that told the you know, the native people that there was something wrong with these people, because who kills their life bearers? Who kills their life bearers? You know, it makes no sense. It's like a people gone mad, you know. And I really, and you know, a lot of this is my own, you know, understanding and research and inquiry and kind of going deeper within to to find this knowledge. I've pulled it from my own sources of communication, even with my own ancestors and whatnot. But it's, my theory about it is that when Europe set out to colonize the world 500 years ago, that it could not have done it if it had not destroyed itself. That something about even the imbalance, between men and women, European men and women, and all of those, I'm sure, who were in the non-binary spectrum in between, because those people for indigenous cultures were always sacred beings.
I know.
So there's something about Europe destroying itself that would allow for the perversion of the psyche to where then they could set about the world and cause such destruction. Do you understand?
Yes.
Does that make sense? It's like there's something that got so out of balance that could allow. So I am such a strong proponent of people doing that, that interrogation, of one's own soil, that archaeology of self, and understanding who you are and where you come from. I would even be a proponent for ceasing to use the words white, black, brown, and actually begin to really dig deeper into who we are and understand who we are, so that we can actually understand the sacredness of who we are as beings. I think it's so important for us to go deeper and, and to begin to decolonize ourselves. Every single one of us, regardless of background, have the work to do of decolonizing our consciousness.
Yeah. Yes, with you a gazillion, million, trillion. I've from the time I was a little girl, I swam in these deep waters. So it's just, I'm listening to it. It's just like balm to my spirit, because I absolutely agree with you. And I've had this, while I do not at all dismiss or deny the importance of Black Lives Matter at all, ever, like not even a shred of that. One of the things that bothered me about this whole delineation of Black, white, Native, Asian was, I felt it was part of the colonization, because even though the skin, I would never dismiss somebody's, the beautiful hue of their skin, we're human race. And each of these are, like, I think of it as ethnicity, but it's not. So I am all for Black Lives Matter. I just feel like even that was something on this census that was created to divide people, because who doesn't see a person in front of them whose skin color is different than theirs? And that always has bothered me when I've heard people. And years ago, I know I've said it, I'm colorblind, like I don't see, but I did, of course you see somebody's skin color, and it's such a dismissal of who they are and their ancestry to say, oh, I'm colorblind. So I really love what you're talking about, and I think it's so important to do that inner excavation, because I love how you talked about the decolonization of self, because the imprisonment occurs between your ears as well.
Yeah.
In here, right here. And then it becomes what you say, becomes your character, becomes your actions. So 15 million women, oh my God.
Yeah.
That is.
I don't think people really understand, and for those of us who have, ancestors, who came from Europe, though who Europe was sending this way was, the least educated, those with the least resources, those
criminals
who Europe wanted to dispel, and so you're talking about people who over the generations are, generationally uneducated, people who really, going back 100 years and much further, you know, are the lowest common denominator of, and this sounds strangely like eugenics, and I'm not, I'm talking about sort of historically, you know, accurate references to who was actually getting dispelled from Europe and sent here because Europe wanted to get rid of them, you know, and those, I mean, that's really, you know, and my first ancestor that came from Europe, he was an indentured servant. He was owned by an English family. And interestingly enough, his grandfather became an abolitionist, you know, which would make sense because that man who became the abolitionist, well, his grandfather had been, you know, in indentured servitude. He was owned, you know, even though he was an Irishman, you know, whatever. And so, you know, there was, people were coming here in their own complicated circumstances. There was a diaspora because people were trying to get out of Europe because it was, you know, in a lot of ways, it was an unlivable system, you know. And so, and it's, I just think that, you know, and then one side of my family, one part of my family, you know, I am an American descendant of slavery. And those ancestors were Senegalese. They were, you know, from those small tribal groups that came from Senegal, kind of where the Senegalese and Gambian River come together, and, you know, and came into the American Southeast. And then, you know, my mother's family essentially were Native people, but with those other bloodlines. And so, you know, I think that to understand the complexity of who we are, it's so not simple, you know, and at the same time, we're not ready for all lives matter. Like, that's not where we're at.
I don't,
you know?
nor should we be.
No, exactly.
Yes, nor should we be. I was not even suggesting that. Yeah.
No, I knew you weren't, but
I just want to be clear, because I've heard white people make this comment of all lives matter, and it you know,
no, they don't understand history.
Yeah, and I'm, you know, my daughter's mixed, my husband is mixed, you know, Black, Native American, and so I just, you know, I hear white people say this, and I think, yeah, well, you really haven't been around, you know, you haven't been around many Black people or Native people to understand the centuries old, you know, really from the beginning of time, racism and being hunted and being just disregarded as a human being. So for you,
and
maybe
it's still happening.
Right, it's still happening. So maybe for you, you think all lives matter, but I got to tell you, I do not. I do think all lives matters, but the time right here is for racial equity. The time right here is for racial equality and justice. The time right here is Black Lives Matter. And
absolutely.
And so,
and I think that people have to realize that, you know, Black liberation is freeing us all.
Yes.
I mean, that's the reality, is that, you know, when I wrote something on a post yesterday because of, you know, standing with the Oshete and all, you know, the Dakota people that were there at Mount Rushmore to block
Yes, I
that
loved
road.
what you wrote. Oh my God.
Yeah, and I just had this moment where I was like, what the times are in right now, it's, you know, there's something about the combination of Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty, you know, that is the magic that will free us. I truly believe that. I think that Black liberation has been, you know, the beacon, the guiding, you know, the guiding light that is showing us through, and we're on a foundation of Indigenous sovereignty. And I think if people understood the importance of, you know, tribal sovereignty, recognizing that these treaties that people have been fighting for, you know, for years and years and years, like, you know, these treaty law being one of the 5 types of law in this nation of law, you know, treaty law being one of the 5 types of law, these treaties protect the land and water for all of us. So again, it's like Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty can free us. You know, that is the magic potion, in my opinion.
I'm with you. I'm with you. So can you speak a little bit about, I've always felt very connected to the word sovereign and liberation. And so is it cultural appropriation? Because in my work, I talk a lot about the work that I do is helping women and especially moms embody their sovereignty as really the leaders and the shapers of the world. And I would not want to be using that word if it was a cultural appropriation. I know that in one of my classes, one of my mentors said that white people use the word tribe, and they're really not, they're not tribal member. Like, we're all from the five tribes, we go back, that kind of thing. But really, tribe is a cultural appropriation. So would you enlighten me about the word sovereign and sovereignty?
I mean, I only speak for myself and my family. I don't by any means represent, anyone's thoughts or ideas about this. I do my best to be educated and to try and speak the truth. And I work for an organization called Illuminative that's run by, brilliant woman, Crystal Echohawk. And Illuminative is endeavoring to do deep systemic work in this country around policy and education, media, pop culture, all of that. So, there might be more formalized, opinions that the organization has come to that perhaps I'm helping to distill that knowledge. But, I do know that generally speaking, yes, I think that using the word tribe as like your tribe, your group of gals that you go to yoga with or something. I mean, I think that kind of usage of tribe is incredibly insidious. And really disrespectful of the fact that tribal nations in this country are fighting now more than ever, particularly with this particular presidential administration. It's been devastating. They've been stealing land. They have been, again, greenlighting these pipelines that the Obama administration had killed several times over. I mean, they've just been so I think that at a time in which we really, really have to be strong allies, as American citizens, we have to be very strong allies to tribal nations. Then, yeah, I would agree that using the word tribe it trivializes the word. I think using it in a private context, sure. Sovereign and sovereignty, that's a really good question. Sovereignty is such an important foundation. It's a much deeper truth than it's older than America. I mean, it represents something, but I have to say that it's a word that I really like also. And I have been using that word more myself. And so, to your question, I think that I don't know, other than I think, again, what I said previously, which is we really, really have to make sure that our distinctions are so clearly in support of tribal nations and tribal sovereignty, because it's so threatened right now by this government. But I think that, in the context of one's own conversations, if you're talking about your own sovereignty of being, there is something that's really important from that. And we can certainly reference, tribal sovereignty and indigenous people as being, again, it's a way of, and I'm not trying to romanticize anything, or glorify, culture. I don't think that's healthy either, but I do think that there's something about indigeneity that's incredibly powerful. And I think there's something about indigenous wisdom worldwide that we truly need, to understand and to learn from. And I'm really not saying that in a romantic or new age way. I'm saying practically speaking, like anywhere you go throughout the world where there's the fight for climate change, the fight for human rights, the fight for land and the rights of water, it's usually indigenous people that are on the front lines of that fight.
Yeah, that's
so
very
we
true.
Really have something to learn from, in our own very private way, in that process of decolonizing our own consciousness and decolonizing self. We are in some sort of a way, in turn, indigenizing, which is becoming more cognizant of our relationship to the earth, more mindful of why it's important for us to protect land and water, and to think of those as living beings that we are in relationship with and that we're responsible to.
Beautiful. So beautiful. Just, I mean, it just in my, it's in my core when I'm like, oh, can you imagine a world where we brought up our children in that way, in that awareness. I mean, I know that's the beauty way. I know that's the native way. I would so love that. I know I did attempt to instill my child with as much reverence for all life and for the earth. Uh, and I think what's happened, and I think it's the colonization. There's just a disregard, and there's a sense of, you know how you, in a relationship, people can take advantage, they just take things for granted. They just, well, you're going to be there, or I could treat you however I want because you're mine, or whatever the perception is. Mm-hmm. And I feel like most people have that relationship to Mama Gaia, to this beautiful, alive organism that is, that holds us, and that it's just taken for granted. And water, which is life. Right? It's just this, and it's always, you know, I'm continually like, I feel so naive and so young in that way sometimes, because when I hear people, I mean, I could almost cry when I hear people that have a resistance and a disregard for Black people or Indigenous people or the earth or water or the air or the sanctity of life. And I don't mean it in that pro-life, like abortion is, you're a murderer, you know, that kind of thing. That's a very unique and specific decision between a woman and her higher power, not mine. And but it hurts me when I hear people, and then I get so angry. It's like I just am like, you know, because you know, just like, how do you mistreat this mama or the mamas? How do you do that? How do you, where? I mean, I think it's just such a disconnect. Like you talked about Europe turning on itself. And I think, how do you do that? And so anyway, I know we could talk for hours. So, and I know. So I'll just close with.
I have some books. I know we
talked about that's where I was going right there.
Okay,
please tell me the books.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Well, there's a few books that I think, you know, are really helpful books. A couple of them I don't have on hand because I've lent them out.
Okay.
But one book that I think is probably the most, in terms of, you know, trying to understand Native American, you know, history, in terms of the Native involvement or, you know, Native history. This, I think, in Indigenous people's history of the United States is just a really good basic book to read to understand, you know, American Indian history. This book is incredibly enlightening.
Ooh.
This is so important, I think, for us, you know, understanding and working towards Black and Indigenous solidarity, which is, you know, a big part of the movement right now, is to not see ourselves, you know, as these separate movements, you know, even if communities are neighboring communities or whatever, or, you know, people are, you know, in the case of your husband and your daughter and, you know, my family, you know, there's so many people, you know, are a mix of what created America. But, you know, but African human beings who descended from Africa and human beings who descended from the Americas were both enslaved in the Americas.
Absolutely.
And, you know, there was a point when 90% of the population of Mexico was enslaved. You know, I mean, and it's, and one of the reasons that they started bringing human beings from Africa into what is currently known as Mexico is because they needed more labor, you know. And so, you know, I think that this book blew my mind in terms of, you know, really understanding that relationship that both Black and Indigenous people have as far as the institution of slavery in the Americas. I think that this is a really important book.
Oh yeah. She's doing something online coming up.
Okay, great. And then I think, I don't have it in hand because again, it's loaned out, but the new Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander's book, I think is really important.
Yes.
Decolonizing Wealth. This is written by a Lumbee man who works in the worlds of philanthropy. So if anybody works in philanthropy or organizations or anything like that, I think Decolonizing Wealth is really important to understand systems of economy in the US. This is from an Ojibwe author, The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee. This book is also such a powerful, powerful history written by you know, a Native man, a Native scholar, that there's a very first person quality to it, because most of what we read in terms of history, particularly, you know, American Indian history, is so written by the anthropologist that it's always this outsider speaking of, and it's really powerful to read when someone is speaking from. Another book that I think is really important if you live in California, or even if you don't, but let's just say, you know, that you are, you know, a resident of the state of California. I think that An American Genocide, the United States and the California Indian Catastrophe, written by Benjamin Madley. This book is, I almost would insist that anyone who lives in California read this book. You have to understand the history of this state. You know, if you're going, I think if we're going to have the integrity of, you know, integrity in living here and being residents on this land, we have to understand what the original people have dealt with. They had 3 waves of genocide: first Spain, then Mexico, and then the United States. And it's this book, American Genocide, the United States and the California Indian Catastrophe, Benjamin Madley. That book is, I just think, extraordinary. So there's, you know, there's many, and anyone can always DM me. This book is very hard to find, but this tells the whole story of Ben Franklin and the Haudenosaunee, and, you know, how the roots of the US Constitution and American, and therefore, you know, European democracy, what we know as democracy in the world today, that it actually comes from Native people. This book is, so
What's
it's out of print.
Word?
It's exemplar of,
exemplar, okay.
Yeah. Does that, so I think it's out of print. You have to find it, you know, on the internet. But for people who are, you know, who are scholars and researchers, you know, these are ways in which I have found to just take myself deeper.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah.
What do you think of the Rolling Thunder Speaks? Is that anything you're familiar with, or a message for Turtle Island?
I haven't read that book.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
So I don't have an opinion on it.
Okay. All right. Well, I thought I would ask. I have a bunch of books too. I remember getting this. Oh my God, this was so long ago. Song of Haika. I can't really say the name. Hiawatha.
Oh yeah, that book. I remember seeing that book when I was a child also.
Yeah.
Just always loved it.
Yeah. I just love. Yeah.
There's some books that have come out of the, perhaps the more new age, you know, and I think that it's always really important to be mindful of the ways in which the new age community, but the kind of the new age movement has participated in cultural appropriation. It's pretty pervasive. And so I think it's always important, you know, to be mindful of that and be responsible of that, you know. It's you know, it's part of the colonial state to feel as though that you can own something if you want to. You know, you can just go be Buddhist because you want to, you know, even if you don't come from those lineages. And I'm not making an argument, I'm just using Buddhist, you know, kind of hypothetically, but you know, whatever it is, there's oftentimes that sense that somebody can have it just simply because they, you know, they want to. And I think that's really important, you know, to be very mindful of that, and to understand, you know, that, you know, going and paying to be in a sweat lodge that's being run by a non-native person. I mean, you just have to be so thorough about understanding those kinds of things. We just have to really question.
I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for saying that. That's really important. And how can people get in touch with you and follow you? And do you have, I know that you are a prolific producer and an influencer, and somebody who really is a truth speaker. So please, can you tell people how to find you and what you're working on?
Well, thank you for asking. And I did mention that I work for this organization, Illuminative. So I'd certainly recommend that people find Illuminatives on Instagram and Twitter. And, you know, also following Crystal Echohawk, who runs the organization. You know, we have a campaign we launched about a week ago to bring down these racist mascots. And there's many people who've been working for a very long time on that issue, and it's an accumulative effort. But in just over a week's time, from this concerted effort on the part of many, and this, you know, this movement, this campaign that Illuminative has launched, we're now seeing that the Washington team is reevaluating. And this morning I saw that the chiefs, that they're also reevaluating their names, you know, and looking at it that, you know, that Native people are human beings, they're not mascots, you know, they don't live in the distant historic past, you know, the people are now. So there's that kind of work. And Illuminative, we have a podcast that I help to produce. It's called Illuminative on Air. If you're a podcast listener, you can go to Illuminative on Air and find our podcast. And then I have movies that are coming out and television series that I'm working on, and, you know, I'm always up to something. But I would say that the narrative change work is some of the most important work that I feel that I'm doing right now. And I'm on Instagram. I'm Heather_Rae22. Rae is spelled R-A-E. And you can tag me, Wendy. You know.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to tag you.
Yeah, I'm on Facebook, and you know, folks can follow me on Instagram or on Facebook. I'm not a Twitterer. I don't Twitter.
You're not in the Twitterverse?
I stopped it with the current presidential administration because I just didn't, you know, as I like pictures. I wanted to be on Instagram. So,
wonderful. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for all that you shared. Thank you for the book list. I'll make sure that when I share our dialogue, that the book list is here as well. And
awesome.
and I will be talking to you soon, I am sure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you again for having me. I really appreciate speaking with you on it. This is a perfect way for me to celebrate this holiday. So it's awesome to have a conversation with you, Wendy. Thank you so much.
It is really, really my pleasure. I feel like it's a blessing. So for all of you that are listening to this, you have an opportunity to have a new experience. You have an opportunity to decolonize your mind. You have an opportunity to educate yourself so that you can make more empowered choices, and so that together we can dissolve any kind of oppressive and repressive structures, and we can end systemic racism. We can end oppression, and we can be those stands for women, for mothers, for the life bearers, and for our children and the next 7 generations. Because one of the things I remember when I was being trained in my Native American prayer circle is that our decisions, it's not only the actions that we take, it's our decisions is what we want, are what we want to consider, because it ripples out. Everything is energy. So I'm just so happy that you were with myself and Heather Rae, who is such a wonderful, active participant in changing the narrative, and really very prolific in her work and in her consciousness, with really contributing to people raising up. So check out Illuminative, and I will make sure you have links to her. And thank you. Thank you
so much.
Yeah, my
Bye.
pleasure.
Thank you very, very much. Bye-bye.
My pleasure. Bye.